In the quiet of a hospital morning, nurses rushed about their daily routines, unaware that their lives and the lives of many others were about to change forever. Suddenly, a small, injured German Shepherd puppy appeared at the entrance, dragging a black bag clenched tightly in his jaws. His fur was matted with blood, his tiny paws trembling, yet he refused to let go. At first, staff thought it was nothing more than trash, but when the bag was finally opened, the entire hospital froze. Doctors gasped, nurses screamed, and even the most experienced paramedics were left speechless. What was inside wasn't garbage. It was a discovery so shocking it would change everything. Stay with us because you won't believe what this puppy revealed. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The morning rush at the city hospital was like any other. Patients lined up at reception, nurses moving briskly from one corridor to another, and doctors flipping through patient charts. The polished floors echoed with the shuffle of footsteps, a place where life and death crossed paths daily. No one could have predicted that within minutes, their ordinary routine would be shattered by something so unusual, so shocking, that it would be remembered for years to come. It began with a sound no one expected to hear inside a hospital lobby. The faint scratching of paws against the tiled floor. Heads turned as a small battered puppy limped through the sliding glass doors. His fur was matted with dirt and blood, patches of skin exposed where wounds had torn him open. His breathing was labored, but his eyes, wide, desperate, and filled with determination, locked onto the first nurse he saw. Clenched in his teeth was a black plastic bag, dragging heavily across the floor as if it carried the weight of the world. Gasps rippled through the lobby. A few patients recoiled in surprise, clutching their belongings closer. Some whispered in confusion, wondering why a stray dog had wandered inside. But the medical staff stood frozen, their instincts warring between curiosity and alarm. The bag dragged behind the puppy left faint streaks across the white tiles, and with every step, the little dog stumbled yet pressed forward, refusing to let go. The nurse closest to him hesitated, her hands halfway raised to cover her mouth. She had seen trauma, pain, even death, but never had she seen an animal bleeding and broken march into the hospital on his own with such fierce determination. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. Behind her, 2 doctors hurried forward, exchanging worried glances. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The puppy stopped in the middle of the lobby, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his tiny frame trembling under the fluorescent lights. The black bag swung slightly from his jaws, landing with a dull thud against the tiles. Whatever was inside, everyone could feel it. This was no ordinary bag. And this was no ordinary arrival. The lobby was dead silent, save for the faint whimper of the puppy and the dragging sound of the bag. Nurses exchanged bewildered looks, unsure whether to approach or keep their distance. Some thought it might just be trash, something meaningless, but then they noticed the way the pup guarded it, refusing to let anyone too close. His small body trembled, yet his eyes shone with a fierce protectiveness that made even the most experienced doctors pause. "Should we take it from him?" one nurse whispered, her voice low as if afraid the puppy might understand. The question hung in the air. What if the bag contained something dangerous? Drugs, sharp objects, or worse? Hospitals often saw strange things, but this was beyond anything they had prepared for. 2 orderlies in white coats cautiously stepped forward, hands outstretched. The puppy's reaction was instant. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat, and his wounded body tensed like a cornered warrior ready to fight. Despite his battered state, his message was clear. Do not touch this bag. The orderlies froze mid-step, startled by the intensity in his eyes. This was not a simple stray. This was a guardian with a mission. Patients in the waiting area began whispering nervously. A mother pulled her child closer, shielding his eyes from the blood on the puppy's fur. An elderly man leaned forward on his cane, his brows furrowed in worry. "That's no ordinary dog," he murmured. Suspicion, fear, and curiosity mingled in the air, creating a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Finally, the head nurse, a woman who had faced countless emergencies, knelt slowly to the puppy's level. Her voice was calm, almost maternal. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, her hand hovering in the air. "We just want to help." For a brief second, the puppy's eyes flickered with hesitation, torn between exhaustion and instinct. But then, as if reminding himself why he was there, he tightened his grip on the bag and let out another determined growl. Whatever was inside that black bag, it was more important than his own pain. And that realization sent chills down every spine in the room. Every second stretched into eternity as the puppy crouched protectively over the black bag. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, quick breaths, his eyes never leaving the people around him. It was as though he was daring them to try and take it. The head nurse swallowed hard, her heart hammering. Whatever was inside, it wasn't just garbage. This dog was fighting for it with everything he had left. A young doctor stepped forward cautiously, pulling on a pair of sterile gloves. "We need to see what's inside," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nerves. The bag lay limp and heavy on the floor, its contents shifting slightly as if something within was alive. Gasps spread across the lobby. A nurse whispered, "Did it just move?" Her words sent a ripple of dread and curiosity through the crowd. The puppy whined, his ears flattening against his head as the doctor reached down. For a moment it seemed he might attack, but instead he released a small, pitiful cry, as if begging them to hurry. The doctor carefully pulled the plastic open. The smell of damp cloth and faint blood wafted out, making several bystanders cover their mouths. Slowly the bag's secret was revealed. Inside were tiny, fragile bodies, newborn puppies. Their fur was damp, their eyes still sealed shut, their little bellies rising and falling with weak, desperate breaths. A soft whimper escaped one of them, so faint it barely carried through the air. The room went silent. Nurses froze in disbelief, their hands trembling as they looked from the injured pup to the helpless litter he had carried. The head nurse pressed her hand against her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. The injured puppy, now barely able to stand, nudged the bag forward with his nose as if to say, "Please save them." His own body was broken and bleeding, but still his mission had been clear, to bring them to safety. And in that moment the hospital staff realized the truth. This puppy wasn't just carrying a bag. He was carrying lives. As the black bag lay open and the newborns whimpered softly, all eyes turned back to the injured pup. His body swayed on trembling legs, his wounds stark under the bright hospital lights. Bandages of dried mud clung to his fur and streaks of blood trailed down his sides. The crowd had been focused on what was inside the bag, but now the reality sank in. This little hero was barely holding himself together. The head nurse knelt closer, her voice breaking. "He's hurt. Badly." She reached out gently, and for the first time the puppy didn't growl. His strength was fading, his breaths ragged and shallow. He leaned against her hand as though he finally allowed himself to rest, trusting that his mission was complete. The contrast was heartbreaking. A tiny body, broken and exhausted yet still alive because of sheer willpower. A doctor crouched beside her, his trained eyes scanning the injuries. "These aren't just from the road," he muttered grimly. "These are signs of abuse." He pointed to deep cuts along the pup's back, bruises on his ribs, and wounds that suggested he had been beaten or mauled. Gasps filled the air once more. The idea that someone had hurt him, and likely tried to dispose of the newborns, sent a wave of anger through the staff. But the little dog's gaze remained steady. Despite his pain, his eyes kept darting to the fragile puppies in the bag. He whimpered, nudging forward weakly, refusing to let them out of his sight. It was as if he was saying, "Don't worry about me, just save them." That unspoken plea struck the doctors harder than any words could. Tears blurred the nurse's vision as she stroked his bloodied fur. "You poor thing. You've carried them this far. We'll take it from here." Her voice cracked with emotion. For the first time, the hospital staff stopped seeing him as just a stray. They saw him as a guardian, a survivor, and above all a brother fighting for his family. And though his body was broken, his spirit burned brighter than ever. The revelation of the tiny litter and the heroic yet broken puppy jolted the hospital staff into action. No longer was this a scene of hesitation. It became an emergency. "Get the veterinary unit on the line now," the head nurse barked, her calm demeanor replaced by urgency. A junior nurse sprinted toward the phone, dialing frantically while others rushed to gather blankets, sterile pads, and whatever supplies they could find to keep the newborns warm. Doctors improvised, transforming one corner of the hospital lobby into a makeshift treatment area. Heat lamps, usually used for premature infants, were quickly wheeled in and adjusted over the shivering pups. Nurses wrapped the tiny bodies in soft towels, whispering soothing words as though the newborns could understand. The air buzzed with tension, but also with determination. Their instincts as caregivers took over. Meanwhile, the older puppy collapsed to the floor, his body trembling from blood loss and exhaustion. A doctor knelt beside him, checking his pulse with the same care he would give a human patient. "He's critical," he announced. "If we don't stabilize him, he won't last the hour." A hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint cries of the newborns. Despite his condition, the wounded pup tried to lift his head, his gaze fixed stubbornly on his siblings. One nurse pressed her palm gently against his head. "Shh, it's okay. We'll take care of them. You've done enough." Her voice cracked with emotion. Yet, even as he closed his eyes, the pup's paw twitched toward the black bag, unwilling to release his guardianship. Finally, the call connected. The nearest veterinary clinic promised to send an emergency team. Until then, the hospital staff took charge, bridging the gap between human and animal care. Phalines meant for children were adapted for the pup, saline drips prepared and oxygen brought close. Patients in the waiting area watched silently, some with tears streaming down their faces. This was no ordinary medical emergency. It was a battle for survival. And for the first time, doctors and nurses weren't just saving human lives. They were racing to save a family bound together by loyalty and love. As the hospital staff worked tirelessly to keep the fragile newborns alive and stabilize the heroic pup, questions began to swirl like a storm no one could ignore. Where had this dog come from? Who had hurt him so brutally? And why had a bag full of newborns been abandoned in the first place? The more they thought about it, the more sinister it all seemed. Security officers were called to the scene, weaving their way through the cluster of onlookers. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, bent down to examine the black bag more closely. Its torn edges and faint stench told a chilling story. It hadn't been carried with care. It had been discarded. This wasn't an accident, he muttered grimly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. The head nurse's lips tightened. She glanced at the wounded pup, who twitched in pain, then at the fragile newborns huddled together under the heat lamp. The pieces began to fit in her mind, but she didn't want to say it aloud. Someone had wanted them gone. Someone had thrown them away as if their lives meant nothing. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the waiting area. Patients and bystanders traded theories in hushed tones. Could it be illegal breeders? One man asked. Or maybe a dog-fighting ring, another woman suggested, her face pale. Each theory carried a heavier weight than the last, but all pointed to the same conclusion. These dogs had come from cruelty, not care. Mark, the hospital's security head, stepped outside for a moment, scanning the streets. Snow still lined the sidewalks, and the world outside looked so ordinary that it was almost surreal. How far had this injured puppy walked? How many miles had he limped with that bag clutched in his jaws just to reach this hospital? The thought made his chest tighten. Inside, the staff pressed forward with their work, but the shadow of the unanswered questions lingered. The mystery of the black bag had only just begun, and the truth, they feared, would be darker than anyone imagined. The hospital lobby, once filled with routine chatter and the shuffle of footsteps, had transformed into a war room. Every nurse, doctor, and orderly moved with purpose, their attention divided between the fragile newborns and the broken hero who had brought them there. It wasn't just medicine at play anymore, it was a fight against time, and every second carried the weight of life or death. The newborns whimpered weakly under the heat lamps, their tiny bodies wrapped in soft towels. A nurse carefully held one against her chest, whispering lullabies as if love itself could keep its heart beating. Another gently massaged a pup's belly to stimulate breathing. Her eyes wet with tears she tried to hide. These were not just animals, they were babies, innocent and helpless, depending entirely on human hands for survival. Meanwhile, across the makeshift treatment corner, the older puppy lay still, his body connected to an IV line adapted from pediatric supplies. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. A doctor checked his vitals and shook his head grimly. "He's fighting," he murmured. "But I don't know for how long." The words hit like a stone in the hearts of everyone within earshot. Yet even in his weakness, the pup's eyes flickered toward the newborns, refusing to let go of his duty. Through the night, the hospital became a place of relentless care. Staff rotated shifts, feeding the newborns with tiny syringes, cleaning their fragile fur and checking their body temperatures every few minutes. Patients who had been waiting for appointments volunteered blankets and warm clothing to help. Strangers became allies in a mission they hadn't expected to be part of. Hours blurred together under the fluorescent glow. Fatigue hung heavy on the staff, but none of them stopped. The stakes were too high. In every corner of the room, people whispered prayers, some silently, some aloud. And through it all, the tiny family of dogs clung to life, fragile, trembling, but unyielding. By dawn, the question remained unanswered. Would their fight be enough? By morning, the hospital was quieter, though exhaustion clung to every face. The newborns had survived the night, fragile but breathing. The older puppy, though still critical, clung to life with the same determination that had carried him through the streets. For a moment, relief swept through the staff. But just as hope began to settle in, the investigation outside the hospital revealed a truth darker than anyone had expected. Local authorities arrived with grim expressions. They had followed the trail left by the black bag, searching alleys and abandoned lots nearby. What they found was horrifying. Evidence of a makeshift breeding den scattered with torn sacks, broken cages, and traces of blood. It was clear. The puppies had not been born into love, but into cruelty. Whoever had kept them had intended to dispose of them like garbage. A police officer stepped into the hospital lobby, his voice heavy. "We believe this puppy came from an illegal dog breeding operation. These dogs were unwanted, discarded." His words hung in the air like poison. Nurses gasped, some covering their mouths, others fighting back tears. The idea that these fragile lives had been tossed aside like trash sent waves of anger through everyone present. The head nurse clenched her fists, her voice trembling. He carried them here, through all that pain, just to give them a chance. Her words captured what everyone was thinking. The small broken puppy had done what no human had, the unthinkable act of saving his siblings. The officer nodded solemnly. "We're opening a full investigation, but make no mistake, without him none of these puppies would be alive." He gestured toward the injured hero, who lay weak but watchful, his eyes never straying far from the newborns. The truth was out. These animals had been victims of human cruelty. Yet in their darkest hour, one wounded pup had risen as their savior, and while the cruelty filled everyone with rage, his courage filled them with hope. Days passed, and the hospital became more than just a place of healing for humans. It transformed into a sanctuary of hope for the tiny family of dogs. The newborns, once weak and silent, began to show signs of life. Their cries grew louder, their movements stronger. Nurses fed them around the clock with tiny bottles, smiling every time a puppy latched on and wiggled its tail in gratitude. Each whimper that echoed through the ward felt like a victory, a reminder that life was choosing to fight back. The older puppy, however, remained the staff's greatest concern. His body bore the scars of unimaginable cruelty, but his spirit never wavered. Slowly, under the care of both the hospital team and the emergency veterinary unit that had joined them, his condition improved. The IV drips restored his strength, his wounds were carefully treated, and his eyes, once clouded with pain, began to glow with resilience. Every time he stirred, the first thing he did was glance toward the newborns, as if ensuring they were safe before focusing on himself. The hospital staff grew deeply attached to him. They named him Shadow, for the way he had appeared suddenly, dragging the black bag like a shadow out of despair and into hope. "He's our little warrior," one nurse whispered as she stroked his head, tears brimming in her eyes. "If he can survive this, so can we." Patients who had watched the ordeal unfold brought blankets, toys, and food. Some even stayed after treatments just to sit quietly beside the recovering family, their presence a silent prayer for healing. Soon, Shadow could stand on his own again. His steps were shaky, but the determination in his eyes remained unbroken. The newborns, nestled in their warm bedding, thrived under constant care, their tiny tails wagging as they squirmed and nuzzled into one another. The hospital, once burdened by tragedy, now pulsed with hope. Against every odd, the fragile lives that had been thrown away were breathing, growing, and fighting to live. It wasn't just recovery. It was a miracle in motion. Word of the hospital's extraordinary rescue spread faster than anyone imagined. A nurse had posted a picture of Shadow lying beside the newborns, his weary eyes watching over them, and within hours it went viral. News stations rushed to cover the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Injured puppy saves his siblings from death, and hospital staff joined forces to rescue abandoned litter. People across the world stopped scrolling, their hearts caught by the image of loyalty and sacrifice. Donations began pouring in. Strangers from different countries sent money, blankets, and supplies to ensure the puppies received everything they needed. Children mailed hand-drawn pictures of Shadow covered in hearts with messages like, "You're our hero." Rescue groups offered permanent homes for the newborns, but the hospital staff already knew they couldn't let them go so easily. The dogs had become part of their family. Reporters who visited the hospital were struck by the atmosphere. Once sterile and clinical, the lobby now brimmed with warmth. The newborns, stronger by the day, would stumble around on wobbly legs, chasing after each other while nurses laughed and clapped. Shadow, though still healing, had become their leader, his watchful eyes never straying far from them. He had gone from victim to protector, from survivor to symbol of hope. One afternoon, a doctor held a press conference outside the hospital. Standing beside Shadow, he told the gathered crowd, "These dogs remind us of something we too often forget, that life, no matter how fragile, is worth fighting for." Shadow didn't just save his siblings. He reminded us of compassion, courage, and the kind of love that changes the world. Applause erupted, some people wiping away tears, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Shadow rested peacefully with his siblings curled beside him. They were safe. They were loved. What began as tragedy had become triumph, and their story would live on forever. Because sometimes the bravest heroes don't wear uniforms or medals. Sometimes they arrive on four legs carrying nothing but love in their hearts.